Good morning. Today our guest is or Jorge Felipe Gonzalez. How do you pronounce your first name?
Jorge.
Okay. All right then. Hi. So today we're going to be talking about one of your articles, and this article was published by Cambridge University, or rather a journal associated with Cambridge University, titled the Transatlantic Slave Trade and the Foundation of the Kingdom of Galinhas in Southern Sierra Leone, 1790 to 1820. What ignited your interest in this line of research?
That was, I would say, over 12 years ago. I was working in the Cuban archive, in the Cuban National Archive in Havana. And I was working on something unrelated to the slave trade itself. I mean, it was related to slavery. I was working on a database on slavery. And then I found this collection of documents on a slave ship that was captured by the British. And that ignited my interest on studying the slave trade. And the result was that I kept researching. And then I found this other collection of documents on this American slave trader that was living in Africa, and then he returned to Cuba. He was sued by Cuban merchants. He went to court, and he presented all these documents on his commercial activities in Africa, which is the base of the article that you read.
All right. So, Felipe, I'm also interested in the topic because the illegal slave trade between America and Cuba is not well known. And what is also underexplored is that after slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, some children were actually captured to be used as slaves in the Americas. And I'm referring to Jamaica.
Yes, yes, you are correct. You are mentioning two important aspects of the slave trade in the 19th century. One is the connections, the slave trading connections between Americans and Cuba and Cubans since the early 19th century. And the other one is the child trafficking in the same century. So in the first case, when I wrote my PhD dissertation, my main argument was that the vertiginous growth of the Cuban-based transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century resulted in part from the transference of American expertise, knowledge, and technology to Cuba after 1808. That means after the United States abolished the transatlantic slave trade. After 1808, many Americans moved to Cuba, and by doing so, they brought with them the connections they had in Africa, which allowed Cubans to connect their own operations with the African coast. The 19th century is also interesting, as you mentioned before, because this is a time where the child trafficking expanded exponentially. There were times by the 1840s, 1850s, that almost half of the captives transported on board the slave ships were childs under 12 years old. There is one case, and I think it's in 1842, a slave ship called Jesus Maria that was captured in the Caribbean, and everyone on board, all the slaves were children below the age of 12. And they later on describe how they were systematically molested by the crew. And that ignited a legal case with the British involved, the Cuban authorities. Nothing happened, of course, like in many of these cases. But this is a good example of the importance of the child trafficking by the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Why this happened? There are many hypotheses why the slave trade in kids expanded so rapidly, but some of them had to do with conditions in Africa, and others had to do with the prosecution of the slave trade, meaning that the slave traders wanted to pack as many slaves as possible in a single voyage. And since kids were small, more manageable, they could do this more easily. There were also another hypothesis that by importing kids, slaveholders in Cuba and Brazil expanded the usage of the labor, of the life expectancy of the slaves. But it's an interesting topic, and I think it's a topic that deserves further attention.
Yes, because long after slavery was abolished, the global illegal transatlantic slave trade continued across the globe, even in the Dahomey Empire of West Africa, for instance.
Yes, that's correct. The first measures to abolish the transatlantic slave trade were taken by northwestern European nations. Denmark was the first in 1803. Well, before that was France during the French Revolution. They later reinstated the slave trade. But the most important measure was in 1808 when the Americans and the British both abolished the transatlantic slave trade. And after that, there was a huge campaign led mostly by the British to prosecute slave traders in the Americas and also in Africa. The prosecution of the slave trade wasn't initially as successful as the British expected to be. The slave trade peaked in the 19th century. Cuba and Brazil became the most important slave trading nations in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was the last place to import the slaves. The last slave ship known arrived on the island in 1864, meaning during the Civil War in the United States. But what happened later, as you mentioned before, is that the slave trade effectively ended in the Western Hemisphere, but it continued in Africa. It continued in the Ottoman Empire. It continued in some Asian regions. And what you have is diplomatic pressures by the British, colonialism as well, because this is part of the history of British colonialism, and trying to sign treaties with kings and rulers to prohibit the slave trade. In fact, until the 20th century, until very recently, there were even some states that considered legal the slave trade. For example, eunuchs in the Ottoman Empire, they existed almost until the early 20th century. So it is a long campaign that, of course, it hasn't ended because, as you know, slavery and forced captivity is still part of our worldly problems.
Mauritania and Libya are examples of countries where people are still enslaved, illegally, that is.
Yes, you are correct. Mauritania and Libya, I don't know if you saw recently, by recently I mean a couple of years ago, these disguised journalists who actually recorded the slave market in Libya is awful. And the slave trade continued there, and that's one major problem as part of the campaign against human trafficking. People don't realize that slavery is not a matter of the past, but slavery is still among us, and it is a campaign that hasn't ended yet.
The state of enslavement in some parts of the world is an international embarrassment. Even a few years ago, an article was published saying that anti-slavery activists in Mauritania were being harassed by the government.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yes.
How was that?
Yeah, the article was published a couple of years ago, maybe 8 or so. It's an old article, but in Mauritania, slavery is still problematic. So although slavery is illegal on paper, people are still being enslaved, and as a result, the rhetoric of anti-slavery activists is a bit aggressive, but it's still discussed by the political classes in Mauritania today at the highest level.
Right. I imagine that one of the main problems to end slavery in Mauritania, and as it was in the Americas and in most places, is how do you break the cultural mindset of the elite, of the culture of these societies, because slavery is not just, as you know, it's not just a matter of laws or legislation. It's also a mindset. It's the way people see the world in these societies as something normal. And I'm not quite sure what's the strategy that this international institution used to change those cultural norms, because I imagine that's the hardest part, not changing the law, right?
Let me read an excerpt from this article titled Activists Warn Over Slavery as Mauritania Joins UN Human Rights Council. And this piece was published in 2020. And I read, Mauritania is backsliding in efforts to eliminate descent-based slavery. An activist and opposition member has warned as the West African country joined the UN Human Rights Council for the first time this week.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting.
Yes, people are aware that there's still a semblance of enslavement in Mauritania, but they are oblivious as to the extent of enslavement.
Right. Do you know if these slaves in Mauritania, do they serve an economic function, or they exist mostly for reasons of prestige for the elite or the ruling class, or just as part of the traditional norms, or they are actually used for economic reason, let's say mining or working on certain sectors of the economy? Do you know that?
In places like Mauritania and Saudi Arabia, slaves often serve an economic function, especially in especially in Saudi Arabia. Many of them were lured into thinking that employment in a domestic setting would have
Right.
enhanced their quality of life.
Right. Fascinating. You see, one of the
Yeah, and in Mauritania, the situation is quite similar. Many of them are domestic servants or bonded laborers.
domestic servants, of
Yes.
course, yes. Uh, you see, I have spent so much time, years working on first working on my PhD with this, and now working on the book on the slave trade. That something that I eventually need to spend some time is reading on modern slave trafficking, because it would be interesting to teach a class. That's something I have been considering for a while, to teach a class here at UTSA on slavery, but a broad perspective, historical, but also modern day slavery.
It's likewise in Nigeria, slavery was abolished years ago, but
Right.
there's still the practice of employing children from villages to work in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And even if these children are paid, they're poorly treated. And usually there's a deal between the parent and the person who is hosting the children. So the
Right.
children are expected to work, and by working, their quality of life should improve. And in the long term, they ought to access education. But people tend to revoke the original contract. So usually these children become laborers who are simply oppressed.
Huh.
I would not necessarily refer to them as slaves, but they're
Right.
not treated properly.
They are servants. Lipton, and I have a question. Do you know if these kids, let's say in the case of Nigeria, do you know if they are from a different ethnic group? Because
No,
something that is
okay.
Mhm.
Interesting point. You're making an interesting point about slavery in Nigeria and ethnic group. So
Mhm.
according to some writers, out-group trust in Nigeria is low. But what's fascinating in Nigeria is that if you are part of ethnic group A, you're more likely to visit your village to get children from ethnic group A and not B group.
Right. Right.
Because in order if you're going to hand over your children to someone, you have to trust that person.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
So
Oh,
and this is why it's even more pathetic, because the children who are being treated poorly are part of the same ethnic group.
So that means that this, let's say, this mother or clan or family who give their kids to another family from the same ethnic group, that means that I imagine that the reason must be probably poverty or
Yes, poverty.
yeah.
And these parents are not wicked. Some of them may be naive, but many of them are handing over their children with the expectation that their children will be educated in the city.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to comment that I think that this is not even new, in the system of how enslavement or bondage or coerced labor work, because one of the ways in which these kids were acquiring Africa, for based on what I have read on Western Africa, was actually pretty similar in the sense that there were families who gave up their kids because they didn't have the means to sustain them. And of course, there were unscrupulous people who took that and sold them.
Yes. Yeah, so during the duration of our conversation, I just stumbled up on an article titled "Ending Hereditary Slavery in Mauritania: Bidan Whites and Black Slaves in 2021." I've yet to read the article, but it seems to be food for thought. Just look at it: "Ending Hereditary Slavery in Mauritania."
Okay, I will
We would,
look at it.
yeah, we would expect that hereditary slavery would no longer be a problem.
Yeah, yes, correct. And I wonder if the same about Mauritania, if in the case of the slaves, they are from a different religious or ethnic group of the population. Uh,
So based on how slavery has been structured in Africa, the
mhm.
slave is viewed as a stranger, is an outsider. But as we established earlier, due to economic needs, some people may become slaves even though they're part of the same ethnic group. But in Mauritania, color plays a role in how resources are distributed. Well, this is
Right,
one factor affecting enslavement. More
right.
than
Uh-huh.
slaves tend to be people who are darker.
Darker. Mm-hmm. That's also common in many. It used to be common until
Yes.
very
The
recently
Arab
in
Berber,
Islamic countries.
the Arab Berber group, they're usually the enslavers.
Yes, that was the case also in the Ottoman Empire. That was the case in Northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula of the Middle East. That they imported many Africans that served as a slave, and slaves tend to be darker. In fact, actually, I was reading that in the case of the Ottoman Empire, they had slaves who were, some of them were Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, and some of them were European, Christians European,
Yes.
either Slavic or, no, or Western European. And there was even a preference among the Ottomans for the lighter slaves. The lighter slaves had better positions in some cases in the military, like the Janissaries, than the darker slaves.
And the Ottomans, they liked women. They
Yes,
preferred female slaves, and many of their white slaves were taken from southeastern Europe.
absolutely, absolutely. And I that's something I was explaining my students the other day, because we were discussing on race, and I don't know if you know this book by Eric Williams,
Yes,
Capitalism.
I'm from the Caribbean.
Oh, perfect. Where are you from?
I'm from Jamaica.
Okay, I'm from Cuba. I'm also from the Caribbean. I was saying that the Eric Williams book, he makes this argument that racism was an invention of the transatlantic slave trade, and I was showing my students some writings by theologians, Islamic theologians in the 9th and 10th century, long before the transatlantic slave trade. And they have a whole racial definition of slavery, like very clear, very biological, in which Africans, if you have read that, it sounds like a Southern, US Southern text. But there were clear biological, racial differentiation in the writings, in the way they approach Africans.
Racism and ethnocentrism are concepts that are older than the Enlightenment.
Absolutely.
And we know this by reading the writings of Islamic writers, Islamic traders and philosophers. They enjoyed jottings on race.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ibn Khaldun is an example. He wrote, Ibn Khaldun made several observations, and many of his peers observe differences based on color and culture.
Yes, yes, which is exactly, which is disprove Eric Williams' thesis argument that the slavery, that the whole racism was an invention of resulting from the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah.
Yeah, Eric Williams, his writings are still popular. Felipe, I'm going to call it Felipe because it's easier to pronounce. Human trafficking. Should we construe human trafficking as a form of slavery?
That's a good question.
Because it is seen as slavery.
I have an example that I encountered recently, and actually there was in the news. There was this person that was trafficking, I would say that's the right word, Cubans actually to the United States. And that's considered human trafficking, that he was charged for human trafficking. He was getting a fee, transporting them, bringing them, and that was considered human trafficking. And that's hardly, obviously, that's an illegal, that was an illegal service he was providing, this transportation violating every possible laws. But the result of that was not enslavement. The result of the whole activity of transporting these people across borders. And so I'm not quite sure that the idea of human trafficking necessarily means slavery. Human trafficking is an stage that does not have necessarily to end in slavery.
Victims of human trafficking are bonded laborers for the duration of their life, or as long as they are held in captivity by criminals. But their status is not heritable. However, I cannot, or should I say, I should not be making this comment, because if you are a bonded laborer and you're, I shouldn't call him boss, but the person exploiting you is an aggressive gangster and you get pregnant, more than likely he's going to appropriate the labor of your children. So I can't comment without analyzing data on the heritability of status in human trafficking.
I understand, but what do you make, Lipton, on this issue? I understand if the end of human trafficking is enslavement, it is pretty much a slavery. But what do you make on this legal definition of human trafficking used for people who transport migrants? Because that's pretty common in the Mediterranean. It's pretty common in the United States, in the U.S. South.
Yeah. People
they are prosecuted for human trafficking. Yet the goal of that often is not a slavery, it's just transporting people. So,
yeah, that's a legitimate market for people. So slavery is a market for people, but an illegitimate market. Immigration-based human trafficking is illegal, but it is a legitimate market for people. That's not slavery.
Exactly. But yet the concept is, one way to see human trafficking, let's say, one of that is pretty common, even inside the United States and the Western world, is women who are trafficked for sexual enslavement, let's say, or sexual coercion. That's slave. That ends in form of coerced decisions against the will of the female. But then you have these other cases of people who are being transported. These people are paying for the transportation illegally. The whole thing is illegal, of course, against the law. and they are paying for the transportation, and you have others who are transporting these people, and if they are caught, those transporting them, the migrants, are considered human traffickers, which is the same definition that is used for those who, let's say, traffic a slave in Libya or Mauritania. So I wonder if
Incomparable.
incomparable, but the term is the same, correct? The term that they use.
Yeah, but if you traffic someone with their consent to America, that's not slavery because the person's consent was involved, and in the long term, the individual will not be a slave in the States. However,
Absolutely, absolutely.
you have breached the immigration laws of America. Therefore, you can be charged for breaching such laws, but
Absolutely.
you are not an enslaver.
So that means, going back to your original question, that means that not always slave trafficking means slavery. Sorry, I didn't. What I'm saying is not always human trafficking means slavery. Human trafficking can be applied and practiced without ending in slavery, according to the law. That's what I'm going to. So what I'm trying to go is, what I'm heading to is that, going back to your question, that the human trafficking is equivalent to slavery, then the result will be depends what the circumstances are.
And trafficking can only occur when a black market exists. Therefore,
Right.
these people are being trafficked because of the black market for immigrant labor. They choose to not migrate legally to the States, and as such, they're trafficked illegally into America. So there's a black market for labor. Labor is a different market.
Correct. Well, and what do you make? Since we are discussing this, I have a question. Then, what do you make of many of these migrants who paid for this service of transportation to these coyotes? They are called in the U.S. South, in the border with Texas. So they pay for this transportation, but they just transported them across the border. There is no end of labor on the other side, meaning that the person who is transporting them doesn't have any agreement with, let's say, an employer on the United States. He just transports them. He leaves them, he dropped them there in the United States, and his work is done. In that case, there is no demand. He's just offering a service that is directly related to immigration itself.
There is a demand. Labor prospective workers are demanding to become laborers in America. So the assumption is that upon entering the States, they're going to craft out a niche for themselves. They want to access the amenities that are available in America. But the
Right.
person selling the service is not obligated to secure employment for these people.
Yes, that's what I mean. Yes, exactly. I know. Yes, of course, there is a demand. People know there is a demand. That's why they come over here. They know they can get a job and have a better life. But the thing is that those people offering this service, they don't have an end decision in the employment yet.
Felipe, I've written that the immigration system in America should be privatized. Therefore, if a manufacturer wants to obtain laborers and people in Mexico want to work at his manufacturing plant, he should be able to vet them, and successful applicants are to receive a visa to migrate in America. Privatizing immigration. Presently, the state has the capacity to deliver, sorry, not deliver, to provide visa. This is a function of the state. States grant citizenship. I think that the notion of citizenship should be privatized.
Well, the thing is that they tried that already. That's something that they did already, not only in the United States, also in the Caribbean, by the way.
How did they do it? How exactly did they do it?
They had these companies, let's say, for example, in the case of the Caribbean, like the case of Cuba, for example, they had this multinational company, like the United Fruit Company and many other sugar producers and factories in Cuba. and they needed labor, and the companies just imported their own labor from Jamaica or Haiti. And
Exactly, Felipe. And you're making a counterpoint. Starting since slavery was established in the Caribbean up until the 1950s, there were a number of companies created to grant citizenship to white people and to employ laborers. But in modern 21st centuries, can an ordinary employer or manufacturer grant visa or citizenship to an immigrant? This is what I'm proposing, something that's more radical.
right, that was. But what I'm saying is that they tried already, but they stopped doing that because the thing is, I don't know the rationale exactly behind it, but I think there is something about the conflicts of interest between private interest and the public good. Uh,
But on the upside, privatizing citizenship can actually improve the quality of laborers. Despite criticism of the American immigration system, it is flexible and quite conducive to the interests of immigrants. John
mhm.
Brown from Mexico can migrate to America illegally and then apply for citizenship. In Canada, it is difficult to get a visa. When you're from certain countries, in order to get a Canadian visa, you must illustrate that your bank account can support your lifestyle in Canada.
Yes, and you usually.
Immigration policies in America are actually quite weak when compared to other countries in North America and Europe.
Oh, absolutely. I always insist on that. The immigration system in the United States is much flexible than many other developed nations. In Canada, as you mentioned, it's extremely hard to get admitted. Not only you need to have bank account, you also need to have an education and a profession, a career. It's really hard. But I'm not quite convinced that the whole system of immigration, that privatizing the whole system of immigration is actually a solution, because citizenship is something that goes beyond
Yeah,
uh,
it's sacred,
private
it's
interest.
metaphysical, but I'm not sentimental.
Yeah, no. I don't mean in any sentimental way. I mean in a practical way, because it's not about sentiments. It's about the fact that many of these private companies sometimes fail and go bankrupt. And then at the end, like let's say, as it happened in 2008 with the crisis, the economic crisis, what happened is that then the state has to step in and take the matters in their hand. That's usually what happened with crisis. It happened with the Great Depression in 1929. It happened in 2008. The state has to step in. So there is a part where private companies can't manage the situation. So the next question would be, what happened with this floating population that was relying on a particular employment from a particular employee and then goes bankrupt? For example, in the case of Cuba, many of these sugar workers, like in the United States in the early 20th century, those who were working in plantations in the South, Mexican American, for example, precisely because they were subjected to the will of the company, the level of exploitation and rights was diminished enormously. So there is something to be said about the dangers of privatizing citizenship. It's not about sentiments. It's not about the nation as a cultural unit. It's about all these failures that could happen, the unintended consequences of this.
If
Um,
failures are part of the market process. When markets fails, we gain insight into policies that will not work. So I don't view market failure as an excuse for government failure or an indictment on the market, but this is a separate issue. But back to your point about unemployment.
mhm,
Under the present system of immigration, John
mhm.
Brown can file for his son to become a citizen of the United States. And this son does not need to declare that he will not become a burden, especially if he is a minor. With economic migration, in the same where private entrepreneurs are securing immigrants to the States, these people will be migrating to America to work. And if the company fails, this is unfortunate, but they can always get another job. In an economy, businesses rise and fall. So I get your point perfectly, and it is quite pragmatic. But economic migrants have a specific reason to migrate to America or any other country. So we know that these individuals are residing in America to work, create, and produce.
Right.
So in this sense, economic migration can reduce negative immigration. Some people claim that immigrants are becoming a burden on the welfare system or that they commit crime. I'm not going to discuss these issues today, but if you're serious about enhancing the quality of people who migrate to America, then privatizing citizenship could be a solution.
Yeah, I get your point. And of course, my argument is not directed to what you mentioned on the immigrants as public burden, because it is pointless to discuss that. But what I think is that in relation to immigrants, privatizing migration is that my concern, to put it in a different way, is the unintended consequences when the private employees can't take care of the situation, and the state always step in. But you're right that they in theory could get another employment, but the problem is that sometimes the whole system collapses. So the point, putting a different perspective, is if a society needs a sort of organizing system to regulate this flow of people, because individual businesses are not a comprehensive system that can regulate this, because each individual system is pulling to their own interest. Every company, of course, is driven by their own self-interest. The point is it should be about all these conflicting interests, a major structure called the state that takes care of all these system of regulation, that have control of all this, because this come with other implications: infrastructure, healthcare system, you name it, the whole system for people to live in.
I'm not an American, but I do understand some concerns. But on this show, we're data driven. Recently, not someone on Twitter, I made an offer to some of my followers, and a person responded, and I shared data showing statistics on immigration and the crime. So according to data in the States, immigrants are not necessarily more likely to commit serious crimes when compared to natives, but the case in Europe is different. So in America, immigrants may be less likely to commit serious crimes. In Europe, the immigrant population is more likely to commit serious crimes, and it's explainable by a number of factors. Compared to America, Europe is more peaceful, and many of the migrants who are entering Europe are people with significant disadvantages and social burdens. And this is why they're migrating to Europe, because they're not middle or upper middle class in their countries. They're from the working class, and there's a relationship between working class status and criminal activities for many reasons. So in the European context is different from the American context, and I did that just to be balanced. So in the States, they're less likely to commit serious crimes, but this does not mean that more broadly immigrants are more peaceful than the native population. And again, historically, even European immigrants were a bit problematic. Eastern Europeans and Jews were not preferred by the Anglo-Saxon elite. So immigration is always a contentious issue in American culture.
Right.
My own take is that if you're going to migrate to a foreign country, you should attempt to assimilate. That's my own take. Create a plural society. So the groups respect each other, but they don't have to mingle. This is just my personal view.
Right. No, that's fascinating. But what do you make out of this? I mean, this is an argument that I have heard a lot among people who are in favor of regulating immigration, and it's this: if you let private companies to take over the regulation of the job market and access to migration to work in their companies, you could have the result that these companies, of course, like companies do, they're trying to find labor that is cheaper.
Or
Labor
cheap
that is
labor.
cheap labor, of course. And that goes not only for manual labor, also for professional technological labor.
Yeah. Do you know?
And the question would be, if there is no state regulation, if you let that private companies to decide that, how does that affect the citizens of those countries who are then deprived of those laborers? Or if they're not deprived of those employment, the wages go down. And
Okay.
that's a legitimate concern. I
Well, it
believe.
is a legitimate concern and it has been answered by many writers.
Okay.
American immigrants and American natives and immigrants are competing for different jobs. Occupational segregation is an important factor. So an American person could be the cashier and the immigrant is washing the dishes. They're competing for different jobs. And yes, immigrant labor negatively affects the incomes of working class people. We have good data on the topic, but
Right.
Black Americans, they are particularly at a disadvantage due to immigration. And for
Yes.
years, even in the 90s, polls were showing that African Americans are skeptical of immigration. And this is one reason why many of them, well, not many, this is one reason why some of them voted for Donald Trump. The
Right.
views of Donald Trump and some African Americans converge in the arena of immigration. So white people who make this argument are actually defending working class blacks, not whites, because
Right.
the evidence is also suggesting that many of these working class white communities actually adjusted to globalization and to the decline of manufacturing. So
Yes.
working class blacks, they're actually being disprivileged due to immigration when it has a negative impact on labor.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I have read similar studies, and especially when the whole election process was happening. But this going back to, but this being that the case, but going back to your point, then that means that the deregulation of the immigration system, like privatization, for example, would disproportionately affect working class Americans, especially those that are more affected, like Black and people of color.
Yes.
So that means that there is something to be said against the complete deregulation of the immigration system, because that will affect those at the bottom of the society. What do you think about that as a counter argument?
But we can't. I get what you're saying perfectly. But another suggestion to upgrade the skills of minority groups is to invest in the tax system. So
Mm-hmm.
about 4 years ago, I was at a conference at the Cato Institute, and an economist was explaining to us, oh, the tax system makes it difficult for people to increase human capital formation. I'm not an expert on the US tax system, but
Mm-hmm.
many regulations that were created by legislators have a disproportionate impact on minorities. So in order to upgrade the quality of the minority labor force, US legislators have to re-examine their tax systems and some of their regulatory burdens. So this is one way to solve the problem of immigration destroying jobs by upgrading the skills of minority groups.
You see, I agree. I agree with you. But I also agreed that the best way to uplift not only people of colors, but also at the bottom of the society of from any race or social origin is economic growth, is achieving economic growth.
Yes.
And I also believe that because that has been historical experience that economic growth is mostly achieved by private enterprise acting as freely as possible and with less burden as they can have. And I actually do agree with that. But but at the same time, there is something to be said about the need of some form of social regulation. It's a fragile balance, and I'm not an expert, as you know. I was working on the slave trade on Galinhas, but there is a fragile balance there between the liberalization of the economy to achieve economic growth, which I do think is vital, and some form of intervention on the economy to avoid the excesses of exploitation.
But,
So,
Felipe, you keep referring to exploitation, and again, the evidence on markets is quite clear. Virgil Store has a book on the topic with his co-author, and there are many empirical studies. Markets are more likely to promote tolerance and diversity than exploitation.
I do
Even
agree.
during slavery, racist white people would do business with free blacks and enslaved people.
No, I would say that yes, economic growth promotes more peaceful relations and tranquility in every society. Societies get even more environmentally conscious. Societies have more like social consciousness when they became wealthier. That is clear to me. But what is not clear to me is that every type of how can I put this? Every type of social welfare that exists in the society is just only and exclusively the result of free market. For more that I love free market. I'm going to use an example of slavery that you mentioned because I have been thinking about this a lot lately. The peak of the transatlantic slave trade, and this is fascinating, happened at the same time that England started applying liberal policies in its economy. All the ideas of Adam Smith, the implementation of that, the regulation, the crown said, if you want to go to Africa, purchase captive and bring it to the West Indies, just do it. I'm going to lift as many regulations as I can. That's what the crown did. And that happened at the late 17th century. And what you have is a peak of the British slave trade at the 18th century. So the deregulation unleashed the forces of the market. And the forces of the market traded in everything they could, including human beings. So an avalanche of slave traders who went to Africa from England, purchased slaves, and brought them to the West Indies. They got wealthy, of course, and you can see the economic growth in the number of slaves that were transported. And of course, the number of slaves translated into sugar production. But what actually controlled that system, if you have let the market just operate freely, slavery would have lasted longer. What actually controlled that system was the abolitionist policy, and the abolitionist policy was an anti-market system, where the abolitionists were saying the law of the market, when they apply to human trafficking, needs to have a limit. And we need to stop the greed of these people trading slaves. And then what you have is this interesting case where the free market is enabling this economic growth, including the transportation of Africans, the trade in human beings. And then you have the abolitionists with these anti-market forces saying, we need to stop this. And I think that this is something similar, for example, later in time, with some individual rights that have been achieved over the past 100 years, let's say eliminating child labor or the minimum wage or pay leave or some welfare state. And I think that's also part of the picture of the social stability. It's not only market. What do you
Yeah.
think about
If I agree with you, Felipe, and I actually have a paper on the topic. A
that?
market
Okay.
for slavery is still a free market, but I refer to it as a repressive market. So in this
Mhm.
article, I explain why capitalism is incompatible with slavery and why slave markets are incongruous with freedom. But you're perfectly right. A market for slaves is still a free market.
Right.
So
It's a free market.
it's still a free market.
Yes, it's a free market, but then that means that the abolitionists who were against it are the forces against free market. That's
Not
correct.
not not all markets are just markets.
Okay.
That's the next debate in the history of capitalism and slavery, and I've covered it a bit. Not all markets are just markets. I think that people who claim to be defenders of free market capitalism must grapple with these nuances. Yes, a market for slaves is still a market, but how do you vitiate that market to make a strong case for free market capitalism? These are issues that people who defend markets must study.
Right.
They should not say, oh, slavery is a rent-seeking system and it was not capitalism. That's only part of the debate. Grapple with the concept of a market for slaves being a free market.
No, I think I struggle with this question a lot because as I mentioned before, I think free market is ultimately is responsible of the incredible economic growth that we have. I don't have any doubt about it. But I always struggle with this question on other achievements, uh, social advantages that the society have earned in the past, let's say, 150 years.
And these social advantages emerge due to sentiment. So welfare, government welfare can crowd out private welfare. And during the
Right.
age of mass immigration in America, many welfare organizations targeting immigrants were financed by wealthy white Americans. So if the
Right.
government is unable to fill the gap, the private sector can fill the gap. But unfortunately, government welfare can reduce the incentive to save and invest. And when government welfare is pervasive, some often think that the welfare of their neighbor is the business of the government.
Mhm. Right, but what do you make out of this? That doesn't have to do with free market granting welfare. What do you make out of the case of, let's say, Europe, where you have during the early 20th century all this organized working class social movement of citizens demanding minimum wage, a limit to working hours, and those were passed to legislation not because of the market but because of social movement.
Yeah,
What do you make out of that? Because I struggle with that. I don't have an answer.
the state was responding to social demands. A consequence of civilization is that our demands become more inflated. So
Hmm.
post-capitalism, our standards are different. And as such, our sensibilities will be altered. So we're going to prefer better living conditions, better wages, and adequate access to nutrition. So there are cases of the state responding to the demand of socialist and working class movements. But there's also another response. In
Mhm.
the absence of the state facilitating these demands, would the private sector also respond to them by improving the conditions of workers? Some economists actually say yes. There are people who argue that government employment regulations, both labor-based regulations and safety regulations, are actually disadvantageous to workers. There's an interesting literature on the topic, and some of it is covered in that old book published by the Manhattan Institute titled Myths of Economic. So I can't remember the name of the book at the moment, but it was published by the Manhattan Institute in the 90s.
Hmm. So that's interesting. if I got you correctly, what you're saying is a counterfactual argument might be, unless it's not counterfactual, unless you can, it's actually a fact that in optimal condition without state interference, where there is economic growth, the market itself takes care of improving the life of the
Yes,
worker.
and then Hong Kong and Switzerland are usually cited as examples of countries with low employment rates despite not having a mandated minimum wage. In Germany, for example, the minimum wage is mandated by contractual labor. It is not a nationally mandated minimum wage.
Interesting. But let me ask you something, Lipton, because this is a fascinating question, because market is also embedded in the culture of every nation. It's a market is not only floating around. Market had to ground onto something, and that something is usually the religion of the culture where it landed. It has to do with the cultural practice system like that. So do you think that could apply to that once the market takes over, it overrides any type of cultural differences that might determine the uplifting of those at the bottom? Let's put it in a different way, because I think I'm making my question.
I get your point clearly. And you're going to agree with my response.
Okay.
According to the revolution in the economics of culture, it is difficult for markets to override the host culture. So in individualistic countries are more likely to prefer free market economies. There's also a relationship between national economic mentality and preference for market activities. And this is one of the reasons why free markets do well everywhere, but this is one of the reasons why some people in developing countries are not supportive of free markets, because their culture is different.
Exactly. That's what I was going to. And what do you make out of these places that are not supporting a free market? Do you think that then the state needs to have a higher role? Because you have some societies that, as you mentioned, are not individualistic, like Western European societies.
Yeah, Northwestern European societies are not as individualistic. No, sorry, did you say that?
No, the opposite. What I'm saying is, sorry, it's the opposite. I said wrong. What I'm trying to say is that there are societies, unlike the Northwestern European societies, or the US, as a matter of fact, that are less individualistic. And those societies, for example, let's say Latin America, where you have a different sense of hierarchies, of structure, it has to do with the history of Catholicism or the cultural makeup of these societies. The free market, which actually exists in all these societies, and it actually has provided economic growth in all these societies, but it takes different configurations. And in those configurations, there is more an attention to hierarchies.
Yes, hierarchical societies.
What I wonder if in these societies, the principle that free market led to an improvement of the life of those at the bottom, as sort of more like, let's say, equity, using the modern terminology. Do you think that also applies to these societies? That's my wonder, because they have a different ethos, a different way of looking at labor, a different way of looking at.
It's just like Chile. Chile is often cited as an example of a successful free market economy in the Americas, but today Chile is reversing its free market gains. So to an extent, these countries can enable market-based growth, but there's usually some regression. Remember, in hierarchical societies, regulations are the norm, but regulations make it difficult for ordinary people to create wealth. When it becomes difficult for ordinary people to create wealth, affluent people are viewed with suspicion. And because affluent people are viewed with suspicion, free market capitalism naturally gets a bad rap. There's actually a paper titled "Why Won't Markets Flow to Developing Countries?" and it enunciates these points.
So what I'm saying is that in these societies where there is regulation, those at the bottom consider that the system is rigged.
Yeah, they think the system is rigged.
Therefore, they need to tear down the whole system.
Yes, and they become anti-capitalist. Yes, there's a paper titled.
I have my own share of the extreme form of that in Cuba. I left, as you know, I lived 30 years. Yeah. I mentioned before I'm from Cuba, but I lived most of my life in Cuba, 30 years of them. So I have my own personal experience of the extreme of government control.
Yes. So we're wrapping up, Felipe, and your paper, right. the transatlantic slave trade and the foundation of the Kingdom of Galinhas in southern Sierra Leone, 1790 to 1820. Because the topic of slavery and human trafficking is so interesting, we spent several minutes talking about it at the expense of your paper. So we're going to get back to your paper.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm going to be brief because I plan to wrap up. People like shorter shows. Felipe, in your article, you contend that due to the slave trade, Galinhas became a powerful empire. But not empire, it was a kingdom. But do you know what I really enjoy? When you highlight African agency. European slave traders in this part of Africa, they were subject to duties. Africans had agency.
Right.
This is the part I want you to talk about, and do so briefly because I'm planning to wrap up.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the myths that the abolitionists, first of all, before then the slave trader, but in particular the abolitionists, because most of the way we understand the slave trade today, that comes from the narrative of the abolitionist and the attack of the abolitionist. And one of the myths that they invented is that the Africans were this sort of especially all the African regions. It's difficult to talk about the Africans because this is different cultures and regions and religions. But let's use the terminology that Africans, as they said, were this sort of passive victims at the mercy of the rapacity of the Europeans. So that the Europeans arrived and they did whatever they wanted. They set the rule of the game, and the poor Africans didn't have a say. That's pretty common in the abolitionist narrative, which is understandable. They wanted to make a political point in Europe, and they wanted to make the case of how rapacious the slave traders were. Yet when you actually work on the archive, on the documents, and this is something that many historians have said for a long time, what you realize is that for most of the transatlantic slave trade, who actually, the agency, the individuals who actually had more control in the market, in determining the rules of the market, were actually the Africans who were selling captives, right? And that agency is important because it gives human agency and individuality and role and participation to this activity of the slave trade to the Africans. And by Africans, I mean, for example, the ruling elite that was mostly involved in this, and the traders and all the people who were involved in the slave trade. And the case of Galinhas is also the case, as in most cases in West Africa, during the slave trade, that the Spanish or the white slave traders, once they settle in Africa and start trading there, they have to follow the laws and the costume and the traditions of the society where they're in. And they were the subjects of their landlords, usually the African ruler, that control the region. They have to pay taxes and they have to submit. So it was not this idea that many believe it was of Europeans or Euro-Americans arriving to Africa and just taking control of the situation. That didn't happen.
Exactly. So, Felipe, I'm really enjoying our conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. It was a pleasure to speak to you, Felipe.
Okay. Sorry, what did you say again?
It was a pleasure to speak to you.
It was a pleasure to speak to you as well, Lipton, and thank you for granting this, giving me this opportunity to talk to you.
All right, then. Bye, Felipe.
Bye. Take care.